We're wrapping up part one of the Alive in Messiah course by thinking about God's promise to Israel that if they became a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, then you will be my own treasure from among all people, for all the earth is mine. Which he reaffirmed through Moses, saying, from all the peoples on the face of the earth, Adonai your God has chosen you to be his treasured people. And again through the psalmist, saying, for Adonai has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel as his treasured possession. Now, these highly significant statements about the uniqueness of Israel and God's purposes are not just for Israel, but are also for us who are grafted into Israel, as they speak of how he has chosen to outwork his purposes by placing the extraordinary into the ordinary. And which Paul pictured for us by saying, we have this treasure in jars of clay, to describe how, whether or not we know it, God has placed within us the ability to display his strength in our weakness. As the verse continues, but we have this treasure in jars of clay, so that the surpassing greatness of the power may be from God and not from ourselves. So the focus is then not on how fragile or vulnerable we are, but on God's choice to release the surpassing greatness of his power through us, which then enables the fullness of life that Yeshua promised to be expressed in our lives. The root of which is what God did for Israel when he rescued them out of slavery in Egypt, promising they could be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests who would fulfill a unique purpose, and sending Yeshua to be the Messiah he'd spoken of through the tabernacle, to totally fulfill the conditions of this promise. The final outcome for Israel being that he will set you high above all the nations he has made for praise, fame, and honor, and that you are to be a holy people to Adonai, your God. Indeed, that God's choice of Israel as his own treasure from among all people will not only be seen as a light to the nations, but will also be witnessed by the entire heavenly realm to bring glory to God for changing what was so ordinary into something so extraordinary. And which the Hebrew word for treasure, the word segula, alludes to, describing a possession that has been carefully chosen by its owner, not necessarily for its intrinsic value, but possibly for its provenance, through who had made it, or who had previously owned it. And clearly Paul had identified this as the reason for God's choice of Israel. Because to conclude its argument for God's continuing purposes through Israel in Romans 11, he said, concerning the good news, they are hostile for your sake. But concerning chosenness, they are loved on account of the fathers. The fathers being the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who, as the story behind the story of why Israel would always be treasured by God, was then also the explanation of why, as Romans 11:29 says, the gifts and the calling God had given to Israel were irrevocable. To the extent that for us who are only grafted into Israel, we can also be connected into the dynamic of being God's own treasure, with all its potential and purpose to display his surpassing power through us, not only to the nations on earth, but even into the heavenly realms. As the first believers demonstrated so effectively, as the 7 communities of Revelation chapters 2 to 3 were urged to demonstrate by overcoming their own circumstances, and as will be demonstrated by those who will proclaim the gospel of the kingdom to all the nations before the end finally comes. But that said, Paul's testimony of witnessing to God's empowering was still not about some kind of triumphalism. Because after speaking about the surpassing greatness of God's power, he continued, "We are hard pressed in every way, yet not crushed. Perplexed, yet not in despair. Persecuted, yet not forsaken. Struck down, yet not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Yeshua, so that the life of Yeshua may also be revealed in our mortal body." So, tough as Paul's conclusion was, this is what being alive in Messiah is really all about. It's to enable the life of Messiah Yeshua to be revealed in our mortal bodies in whatever way that might involve, so that it brings glory to him. And this includes facing situations that are humanly impossible. The overall purpose being that just as the tabernacle foretold the first coming of the Messiah, we can be used to foretell his second coming. The opportunity and the need for which could be about to grow rapidly as, according to the prophecies in Torah about God's final shakings of the world, what we're witnessing today is as nothing compared to what is to come. Here's just 3 of them. People will flee to caves in the rocks and to holes in the ground from the dread of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he rises to shake the earth. And also, "I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger." As well as this, "See, the name of the Lord comes from afar. His breath is like a raging torrent rising up to the neck. He shakes the nations in the sieve of destruction." Now, when everything's shaking, clay jars are not likely to stay upright for long, let alone stay in one piece, unless, that is, they're weighed down with stones. As this pictures how our greatest problem can then become our greatest opportunity. Because the weight of the treasure we have within us can enable us to stay standing, and in doing so to demonstrate the surpassing greatness of his power. Though for that to happen, we do have to appreciate the gravity of the calling, the gifting, and the promises that God gave to Israel. And to do that, the place for us to draw insight from about it is again the tabernacle. This time through the breastplate worn by the high priest when he entered the Holy of Holies on the annual Day of Atonement. Because according to Exodus 28, as he stood before the ark in the awesome presence of God, his breastplate represented the people of Israel. God having told Moses to set within it 4 rows of jewels, a row of ruby, topaz, and emerald for the first row, a turquoise, a sapphire, and a diamond for the second row, a jacinth, an agate, and an amethyst for the third, and a beryl, an onyx, and a jasper for the 4th row. They are to be enclosed in gold filigree settings. The stones are to be engraved in the order of the names of Israel, 12 according to their names, like the etchings of a signet seal, one corresponding to each name of the 12 tribes. So, whilst the stones only had a modest value in themselves, they became precious treasure in God's sight as they represented the 12 tribes who were descended from the patriarchs that God had chosen to love, such that as the high priest interceded for them, they were declared righteous even though manifestly they were not. And this took on an even greater significance when Yeshua fulfilled what this foretold, as the book of Hebrews speaks into saying, "When Messiah appeared as high priest of the good things that have now come, passing through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, he entered into the holies once for all. The significance of this being that we are now represented in the gems of Yeshua's breastplate, and that, along with Israel, our names are engraved forever on his heart, being made precious and righteous to the Father through his perfect sacrifice. Meaning that we can have the same weight that enabled the first believers to be kept upright even in the face of great persecution, and to be so used by God in his purposes whilst they still remained as jars of clay. However, this is truth that has to be discovered for ourselves if we're to know the potential and the purpose we can have for the times we're living in. Having been largely lost when the Jewish roots of the Christian faith were severed, leaving believers disconnected from God's foundational promise to Israel, and which has never been properly reconnected to since then. Such that today the truth about being God's own treasure often just gets sentimentalized instead of being seen as what can enable us to stay standing in the face of such shaking as we may encounter. And then through it, to demonstrate the surpassing greatness of his power, even in our weakness. Now, to discover for ourselves the reality of getting hot-wired back to God's foundational promise to Israel, where the letters H-O-T stand for his own treasure, we might need to first make some disconnections from what we've believed in the past, and that could seem costly. But if we do need to, Yeshua encouraged us to dare to do so through the parable of treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid, and because of his joy, he goes out and sells all that he has and buys that field. And so, to help you with your own discovery process, in addition to the questions at the end of each session, we've added some additional resources under the Going Forwards tab for you to dig into, because it is well said that truth which is heard is soon forgotten, but truth which is discovered is long remembered. So please do join me for parts 2 and 3, when we'll go on to think about how we can continually count ourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Messiah Yeshua. But for now, let's end part 1 of the Alive in Messiah course with these 3 questions. How do you understand God has chosen you to be his treasured people? Then secondly, what does it mean for you to be in Messiah Yeshua? And thirdly, how can his power be seen in and through you?